My friends gave me a house worth $70,000. My parents came to me and demanded that I give my house to my brother, now sister, who was transgender, and they sued me. I, 32M, finally got out, but I don't know how to move on from the trauma my parents put me through. This might be a long one, but I feel like I need to get this out. I've never told anyone the full story, and I'm not sure if I ever will. But writing it down here, where I can be anonymous, feels like a start. My parents were monsters. I know a lot of people say that, but I really mean it. I grew up in a small town where everyone knew everyone and appearances were everything. On the outside, my parents were respected. My dad, Jacob, was a church deacon, and my mom, Evelyn, was one of those people who was constantly volunteering for school functions or local fundraisers. Everyone thought they were perfect, and I grew up hearing from other kids how lucky I was to have parents like them. But they had no idea what happened behind closed doors. The abuse started as far back as I can remember. When I was a little kid, I thought it was normal. You know how kids just accept their reality? I didn't realize that not everyone's mom flew into a rage over spilled milk. I didn't know that not every dad came home after work and turned into a cold, terrifying figure who would explode over the smallest things. My earliest memory of being beaten was when I was around 4. I was playing in the living room with my toy cars, pretending the floor was a racetrack. One of the cars scratched the wooden floor, and my mom lost it. She screamed at me, grabbed the car from my hand, and threw it across the room. Then she grabbed me by the arm and dragged me upstairs. I don't even remember what she hit me with, but I remember the pain. I remember crying so hard I couldn't breathe. She told me to stop crying because if my dad came home and saw me like that, it would only be worse. And it was. That night, when Jacob came home, my mom told him what had happened. She didn't mention her part, of course, just that I had ruined the floor. Without a word, he picked me up, threw me onto the bed, and beat me with his belt until I thought I was going to die. I was 4 years old. This wasn't a one-time thing. It happened over and over. I learned early on that if I made even the tiniest mistake, I would pay for it. The punishments were unpredictable. Sometimes I would get away with things, and other times I'd be beaten so badly I couldn't sit down for days. It was like living with a time bomb that could go off at any moment, and I had no way to defuse it. When I started school, I thought things would get better. I thought maybe being away from them for a few hours every day would give me some peace. But school was just another nightmare. I was quiet and kept to myself because I was scared all the time. The other kids picked up on it and bullied me relentlessly. It didn't help that my clothes were always old and shabby, even though my parents had plenty of money. They spent it on themselves, not on me. I remember going to school with holes in my shoes while my mom paraded around in designer outfits. I tried to make friends, but it was impossible. I never invited anyone over because I was terrified they'd see the real side of my parents, or worse, that my parents would beat me in front of them. I couldn't explain why I didn't want people around. The truth was too horrible to say out loud. I thought if I could just make it through school, I'd be able to escape. High school was even worse. By then, the physical abuse had started to slow down, but the emotional and psychological abuse was in full force. My mom loved to remind me how worthless I was. She'd tell me I was ugly, stupid, and that I'd never amount to anything. My dad barely spoke to me at all, except when he was criticizing me or finding some way to make me feel small. They controlled every aspect of my life, what I wore, who I talked to, even what I ate. I wasn't allowed to have opinions or make decisions. If I did, I was punished. The only thing that kept me going was the idea of going to college. I figured if I could get into a good school far away, I could finally be free of them. So, I worked my ass off in school, spending every free moment studying, just trying to prove them wrong. And I did. I got into a university in a different state, hundreds of miles from home. I thought it was my ticket out, but even that wasn't easy. My parents didn't want me to go. They didn't say it outright, but they did everything they could to sabotage me. My mom would tear up my homework or, forget, to sign permission slips for important things. My dad told me I was wasting my time and that I'd never make it through college. When it came time to apply for financial aid, they refused to help. I ended up having to take out loans in my own name, which meant starting adulthood with a mountain of debt. But I didn't care. It was worth it if it meant getting away from them. The day I left for college was one of the strangest days of my life. My parents barely said goodbye. My mom gave me a fake smile and told me to be good, while my dad just grunted and waved me off. No hug, no words of encouragement, nothing. I got in my car and drove away, not looking back. For the first few weeks of college, I was in shock. I didn't know how to function without my parents hovering over me, telling me what to do. I was free, but I didn't know what to do with that freedom. I was still terrified of making mistakes, and I didn't trust anyone. I kept to myself, just like I had in high school. It took me a long time to realize that I didn't have to be scared anymore. College was rough, but it was also where I started to heal, just a little. I met people who didn't treat me like garbage. I had professors who told me I was smart and capable, and that blew my mind. No one had ever told me that before. I started to believe, just a little, that maybe I wasn't as worthless as my parents had made me feel. After graduation, I knew there was no way I could go back home. I'd spent 4 years in a different state, barely talking to my parents, and I was terrified of what would happen if I went back. So, I didn't. I packed up everything I owned and moved to another city, one where I didn't know anyone. I figured if I was going to start over, I might as well do it somewhere completely new. At first, it was exciting. I felt like I could finally live my life without looking over my shoulder. But the trauma from my childhood didn't just disappear. I still have nightmares about my dad coming after me with his belt, or my mom screaming at me, telling me I'm a failure. I flinch whenever someone raises their voice, even if they're not angry with me. I have a hard time trusting people, and I've never been able to maintain a relationship for more than a few months. I'm always waiting for the other shoe to drop, for them to hurt me the way my parents did. I know I need therapy. I've been putting it off for years, telling myself I can handle it on my own, but I can't. The weight of everything is crushing me, and I'm terrified I'll never be able to escape it. I'm 32 years old, and I've spent my entire life trying to outrun the damage my parents did to me. But no matter how far I go, it always feels like they're right behind me. I guess I'm posting this because I don't know where else to turn. Has anyone else gone through something like this? How do you heal from a childhood that was basically one long nightmare? How do you stop the past from ruining your future? I want to be happy. I want to move on, but I don't know how. Hey, everyone. I wasn't expecting so many responses to my last post, and I want to thank everyone who reached out with advice and support. It's been overwhelming, but in a good way. I promised I'd update once I figured things out, and, well, a lot has happened since then. Things have changed, mostly for the better, but it hasn't been easy. After moving to the new city, I found myself struggling. I didn't know anyone, and the trauma from my childhood left me feeling isolated and anxious. I was barely scraping by on a dead-end job, living paycheck to paycheck, and not really making any connections. But then I met someone who changed everything. His name is Noah. We met at a coffee shop where I used to go on my days off to try and write, to process everything I'd been through. I guess I caught his attention because one day he just sat down across from me and started talking. At first, I was defensive. When you've spent your whole life being hurt by people, it's hard to let your guard down. But Noah was persistent in a way that wasn't pushy. He had this easygoing vibe that made me feel comfortable, and eventually, we started talking regularly. Noah was the first person I really opened up to about my past. I didn't go into too much detail, but he could tell that I'd been through some rough stuff. He didn't pry or push, but he listened. He had this way of making me feel heard without judgment, which was something I wasn't used to. Over time, I found myself trusting him more and more, something that terrified me at first but eventually felt like a relief. Noah introduced me to his friend group, which was small but tight-knit. There was Liam, who worked in marketing but had dreams of doing something more meaningful, and Ava, a chef who was always talking about starting her own restaurant but never quite took the leap. They were all so different from the people I'd grown up with, genuine, caring, and supportive. They didn't just talk to fill space or to one-up each other. They had real conversations about things that mattered, and they made me feel like I was part of something for the first time in my life. One night, over drinks, Ava brought up her dream of opening a restaurant again. She'd been talking about it for years, apparently, but she always held back because of the financial risk. Noah, who was a natural at organizing things, suggested they all pitch in and start the restaurant together. At first, I thought they were joking, but they weren't. They looked at me and asked if I'd want to be part of it. I had zero experience in the restaurant business, but Noah and the others didn't care about that. They said what mattered was that I was hardworking, reliable, and part of their group now. After some convincing, I agreed. I'd always thought of myself as someone who wasn't capable of anything like this, but they believed in me in a way no one ever had before. And for the first time, I started to believe in myself too. We spent months planning. Liam handled the business side of things. Noah took care of logistics, and Ava designed the menu. I did whatever I could to help, painting the walls, setting up tables, handling deliveries, anything. It felt like we were building something meaningful together, and I threw myself into it. Of course, there were problems. A lot of them. The first big issue was finding a space for the restaurant. Commercial real estate in the city is ridiculously expensive, and every place we looked at seemed way out of our budget. After weeks of searching, we finally found a spot in an old building that had been empty for years. It was perfect, spacious, with a good location, and the rent was surprisingly affordable. But there was a catch. The place was a mess. The plumbing was shot, the kitchen equipment was ancient, and the whole place reeked of mold. We debated whether it was worth the risk, but ultimately, we decided to go for it. We figured we could fix it up, and with a little hard work, we'd make it our own. That's when the real work began. We spent every spare moment renovating the space, working long hours after our regular jobs. There were nights where I came home covered in dust and paint, my muscles aching, but I didn't care. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was doing something that mattered, something that was mine. As we got closer to opening, more problems popped up. The permits we needed took forever to get approved, and we ended up having to delay our grand opening twice. Money was tight, and there were moments when I was sure we were going to run out of funds before we even opened the doors. But every time we hit a roadblock, Noah would rally us together and remind us why we were doing this. He had this way of keeping us all focused, no matter how stressful things got. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we opened. The first few weeks were rough. We were understaffed, the kitchen was chaotic, and there were more than a few nights where I thought we were going to fail. One night, during our second week, the power went out in the middle of dinner service. Ava was in the kitchen, Liam was handling the front of house, and Noah was managing the orders. I was stuck trying to figure out how to get the lights back on. It turned out the building's electrical system was so old that it couldn't handle the strain of a full restaurant. We had to shut down for the night, and I remember sitting in the dark, convinced we were doomed. But we weren't. The next day, Noah made some calls and got an electrician to come in and upgrade the wiring. Ava reworked the menu to be more streamlined, and Liam put in extra hours to make sure we stayed on top of the books. Slowly, things started to come together. Word of mouth spread, and soon we had a steady stream of customers. The restaurant became this little hidden gem in the city, and people loved it. But it wasn't just the restaurant that was changing, it was me too. For the first time in my life, I felt like I had a family, a real one. Noah, Ava, and Liam weren't just business partners. They were my friends, my support system. They had my back in a way my own parents never did, and that was something I never thought I'd have. Then came the night that changed everything. We had just closed for the night when a man walked in. He was older, maybe in his 50s, and he looked out of place in our casual restaurant. He asked if we were still serving, and even though the kitchen was closed, Ava offered to whip up something quick. While he waited, he started chatting with Noah and Liam. It turned out he was a food critic, one of those big-time writers who could make or break a restaurant with a single review. None of us knew it at the time, but he was there to check us out for his column. A week later, his review was published. It was glowing. He called our restaurant a must-visit and praised Ava's cooking as innovative and bold. Almost overnight, we were flooded with reservations. People were lining up outside before we even opened. It was surreal. We went from barely making ends meet to having a wait list for weeks in advance. But success brought new challenges. With the sudden influx of customers, we were stretched thin. We needed more staff, more supplies, and more space. There were nights when I barely slept, trying to keep up with everything. I was terrified that we were going to crumble under the pressure. But somehow we didn't. We adapted. We hired more people, expanded the menu, and eventually, We even started looking into opening a second location. Through all of this, Noah, Ava, and Liam were my rocks. They kept me grounded when things got crazy, and they reminded me why we started this in the first place. It wasn't about the money or the success. It was about creating something meaningful, something that brought people together. Looking back now, I can't believe how far I've come. Just a few years ago, I was broken, alone, and running from my past. Now, I'm part of something bigger than myself, something that I'm proud of. The restaurant isn't just a job, it's my home. And the people I've met along the way, they're my family. Of course, there are still moments when the trauma from my childhood creeps in. I still have nightmares sometimes, and I still struggle with trust. But for the first time in my life, I feel like I'm moving forward. I'm healing, slowly but surely. And I know that no matter what happens, I'm not doing it alone anymore. After everything that had happened with the restaurant, I thought life couldn't surprise me anymore. I was wrong. It all started on my 33rd birthday, when my friends gave me something that completely changed my life. The day started out pretty normal. Noah, Ava, and Liam had been acting a little strange leading up to it, but I figured they were just planning a small party or a dinner at the restaurant, something casual. I wasn't expecting much. After all, birthdays had never been a big deal in my life. My parents didn't care about them, and for years, I stopped caring too. That afternoon, Noah called me and told me to meet him at this house in a quiet part of town. I thought maybe it was a venue for a little get-together, so I didn't think much of it. When I got there, the place looked pretty old, nothing fancy, but big and a little worn down. I walked in, expecting to see the usual faces, and sure enough, the whole gang was there. Noah, Ava, Liam, and a bunch of people we'd become close with through the restaurant. They had drinks, decorations, and music playing. It was nice, nothing too extravagant, and I was just happy to be there with them. After we cut the cake and everyone was settling into drinks, Noah handed me a small envelope. I wasn't sure what it was, but I figured it was a card or maybe a little gag gift. Inside the envelope, though, was a key. I looked at Noah, confused, and he just smiled and told me to follow him outside. Everyone trailed behind us as we stepped out onto the porch, and that's when Noah said, "This place. It's yours." I didn't know what to say. At first, I thought it was a joke. I laughed, waiting for the punchline, but Noah and the others just stood there, grinning. That's when Ava explained that they had bought the house together for $70,000, a foreclosed property that needed some work, but it was mine, free and clear. They wanted to do this for me because, as they put it, I was family now. I was stunned. Growing up, the idea of someone doing something like this for me was unimaginable. For so long, I had been on my own, fighting for every inch of stability, and now these people were giving me a home, something I could call my own, without strings attached. I felt overwhelmed with gratitude and emotion, and later that night, after everyone left, I just sat in the living room of that old house and let it all sink in. It was the first time in my life I truly felt like I belonged somewhere. Not long after I moved into the house, something else happened. Something I wasn't expecting at all. I met Nora. Nora came into my life quietly, almost without me noticing. She worked at a local flower shop that Ava used to buy flowers from for the restaurant. One day, Ava brought her by one of our gatherings, and we just clicked. It wasn't like I was struck by lightning or anything like that. It was more gradual, like I was getting to know her in pieces. She was kind, gentle, and had a way of making me feel calm, even when I didn't realize I needed it. At first, we just hung out in groups, her, me, Noah, Ava, and Liam. But eventually, Nora and I started spending more time together on our own. I'd stop by her shop to chat, or she'd come over to the house to help me fix up the garden, and slowly, those casual moments turned into something more. I hadn't been in a serious relationship for years, and I wasn't even sure I was ready for one. But with Nora, everything just felt right. One night, we were sitting on the back porch of my house, talking like we always did. She asked me about my past, and for the first time, I felt like I could talk about it without flinching. I didn't go into every detail, but I told her about my parents, the abuse, and how hard it had been for me to trust anyone. She listened quietly, and when I finished, she didn't try to offer any solutions, or tell me how sorry she was. Instead, she just looked at me and said, "You're not broken. You know that, right?" That was the moment I realized I was falling for her. Things moved quickly after that. Nora and I started spending almost every day together. She'd come by after work, and we'd cook dinner together, or we'd go for long walks through the city, just talking about life. For the first time, I felt like I could be myself around someone without fear or hesitation. She made me feel safe in a way I hadn't experienced before. And little by little, the walls I had built up for so many years started to come down. As we got closer, so did my group of friends. We started going to more formal events, like corporate parties, which was new for me. Noah, ever the social butterfly, was always getting us invited to these swanky events through people he knew from the restaurant's growing success. I'd never been to a corporate party before, and honestly, I felt out of place at first. I didn't know how to dress, how to act, or what to say, but Nora was right there beside me, making everything feel easier. The first one we went to was for one of the investors who helped fund our restaurant's second location. The party was held in a fancy ballroom downtown, and everyone was dressed to the nines. Nora looked absolutely stunning in this deep blue dress, and I remember thinking that I was the luckiest guy in the room just to have her by my side. We mingled, drank champagne, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I was just some outsider looking in. I felt like I was part of something. By the end of the night, Nora and I found ourselves on the balcony, away from the noise of the party. She looked at me, her eyes sparkling under the city lights, and said, "You know, you belong here. You're not that scared kid anymore." I didn't know what to say. She was right, though. I wasn't scared anymore. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. After that, things just kept getting better. Nora and I grew closer, and before I knew it, I was thinking about a future with her. It felt natural, like we had been building toward it all along. A year into our relationship, I decided to propose. I wanted to keep it simple, nothing too flashy or over the top. So, one night, after a long day at the restaurant, I invited her over to the house for dinner. We cooked together, just like we always did. Nothing fancy, just pasta and wine. And then we sat on the porch, the place where so many of our meaningful conversations had happened. I didn't have a big speech planned or anything. I just looked at her and said, "Nora, I don't want to spend another day of my life without you. Will you marry me?" Her answer was immediate. She smiled, tears welling up in her eyes, and whispered, "Yes." Our wedding was small but perfect. We held it at the restaurant, with just our closest friends, Noah, Ava, Liam, and a few others who had become part of our lives. Ava cooked up the most incredible meal, and we danced under the stars, surrounded by the people who had become my true family. It wasn't a grand affair, but it was everything I had ever wanted. But just when I thought things were settling into this peaceful, happy rhythm, life threw me another curveball. A few weeks after the wedding, I got a call from my parents. I hadn't spoken to them in years, and honestly, I thought I had finally cut all ties with them. But somehow, they had found out about the wedding. My mother left a voicemail, saying she was hurt that I hadn't invited them, that I had betrayed the family. I was furious. After everything they had put me through, the idea that they could guilt me like that, as if they had any right to my life, was too much. For the first time, I called her back, not to reconcile, but to finally stand up for myself. I told her exactly what I had been holding in for years, that they had lost the right to be part of my life the moment they decided that control was more important than love. I told her I was happy now, that I had found a new family, and I didn't need them anymore. She tried to argue, but I wasn't interested in her excuses or her guilt trips. I hung up, and it felt like a weight had been lifted off my chest. Nora was there when I hung up, her hand resting gently on my back. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. She understood better than anyone what that moment meant for me. Since then, things have been good. Really good. The restaurant is thriving. Nora and I are happier than ever, and for the first time in my life, I feel like I'm living without the shadow of my past hanging over me. I never thought I'd have this life, but here I am, and I'm not going to let anything take it away from me. I thought I had seen the last of my parents after that phone call. For months, I didn't hear a word from them, and I convinced myself that I had finally broken free from their toxic hold on my life. Things were going great. The restaurant was thriving. Nora and I were talking about starting a family, and I was settling into this new chapter with a sense of peace I had never known before. But, as life has a way of doing, that peace was shattered in a way I never could have predicted. It started on a quiet Saturday morning. Nora and I were having breakfast in the kitchen, talking about our plans for the weekend. Nothing special, just a day of gardening and maybe meeting up with Noah and Ava later. We were laughing about something when there was a knock on the door. It wasn't unusual for friends to drop by, so I didn't think anything of it. But when I opened the door, I froze. Standing there, on my doorstep, were my parents. My mother, Evelyn, was wearing the same cold, judgmental expression she had always worn, and my father, Jacob, looked as emotionless as ever. But what caught me off guard the most was the person standing between them, someone I hadn't seen in years. It was my half-brother, Mark, or at least that's who I thought it was at first. But something was different. Mark was different. He had always been a quiet, distant figure in my life, someone I never really connected with. But now, there was something else. He stood there, fidgeting awkwardly, his face flushed with embarrassment. My parents didn't waste any time. Before I could even get a word out, my mother launched into a speech, her voice dripping with condescension. "We've come to claim what's rightfully Mark's," she said, her eyes narrowing at me. I was stunned. "What are you talking about?" My father stepped forward, his voice low and cold. "The house. This house should belong to Mark. He's family, and he needs it more than you do." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They had never cared about me, never lifted a finger to help me when I needed it, and now they were demanding that I give up the home my friends had gifted me? "You've got to be kidding me," I said, my anger rising. "This is my house. You don't get to just show up here and demand it." My mother's face twisted into an ugly sneer. "Your half-brother deserves this house more than you do. He's going through something, and we're trying to help him." That's when Mark spoke up for the first time. His voice was shaky, and I could tell he didn't really want to be there. I've transitioned," he said quietly, his eyes not meeting mine. "I'm a woman now." I blinked, trying to process what he was saying. Mark, who had always been a shadow in my life, had transitioned. He was now living as a woman. That in itself wasn't shocking. I had no problem with his choice to live as he truly was. But the fact that my parents were using this as an excuse to try and take my house, that was unbelievable. "I don't care if Mark has transitioned," I said, my voice firm. "That doesn't give you the right to come here and demand my home." My mother's face hardened. "Mark is struggling, and he needs a fresh start. This house should have been his to begin with. You were always the black sheep of the family, and now you think you can just live happily ever after in this house? It's not right." Nora, who had been listening quietly from behind me, stepped forward. "This is outrageous," she said, her voice steady but full of anger. "You can't just take his home. You've done enough damage to him already." My father's eyes flickered with something, maybe shame, maybe anger, but he stayed silent. My mother, however, wasn't done. "If you won't give it to him," she said, her voice rising, "we'll make sure the courts do." And just like that, they left, leaving Nora and me standing there in shock. I couldn't believe what had just happened. They were actually threatening to take me to court over the house, all because Mark had transitioned and they thought he deserved a new life at my expense. Over the next few days, I tried to brush it off as an empty threat. I thought there was no way they could actually pull something like this off. But then, I got the official notice in the mail. They were suing me for the house, claiming that it had been intended for Mark all along and that I had no right to it. They had somehow forged documents, falsifying signatures, creating fake legal claims that made it look like the house was part of some inheritance deal. It was a total fabrication, but they had gone to great lengths to make it look legitimate. I was furious. For years, I had tried to distance myself from their toxicity, and now they were dragging me back into it, trying to take away the one thing that symbolized my freedom from them. Noah, Ava, and Liam were all shocked when I told them what was happening. "This is insane," Noah said, pacing around the restaurant as we discussed the situation. "They can't just do this. We'll fight it." And fight it we did. We hired a lawyer, a tough woman named Jessica who had dealt with family disputes before. She took one look at the forged documents and immediately knew they were fake, but proving that in court was going to be a long, drawn-out process. The trial was brutal. My parents came at me with everything they had. They lied under oath, produced more fake evidence, and tried to paint me as the ungrateful son who had taken what was rightfully Mark's. They played up Mark's transition, trying to garner sympathy from the judge by claiming that Mark, now living as Maria, needed a safe space to start her new life. It was a nightmare. Sitting in that courtroom, listening to them twist the truth, manipulate the facts, and drag my name through the mud was like living through my childhood all over again. The anxiety, the helplessness, it all came flooding back. But this time, I wasn't alone. Nora was there with me every step of the way, holding my hand, reminding me that I wasn't that scared kid anymore. Noah, Ava, and Liam came to every hearing, supporting me in ways I never thought possible. The trial dragged on for months. At one point, it looked like my parents might actually win. Their lawyer was slick, and the fake documents they had produced were convincing enough to cause serious doubt. But Jessica never gave up. She dug deeper, uncovering more evidence that pointed to the forgery. She found inconsistencies in the signatures, discrepancies in the timelines, and slowly but surely, she started to dismantle their case. One of the most shocking moments came when Jessica managed to get a hold of the notary who had supposedly signed off on the documents my parents had forged. When she questioned him, he admitted that he had never even seen those papers before and had no record of ever notarizing anything for my parents. That was the turning point. It took almost a year, but eventually, the truth came out. The judge ruled in my favor, declaring the documents fraudulent and dismissing my parents' claim to the house. They were forced to pay for all the legal fees, and their reputations were ruined. The court saw them for what they truly were: manipulative, lying people who would go to any lengths to get what they wanted. After the trial, I thought I would feel relief, but mostly, I just felt tired. The emotional toll it had taken on me was more than I had expected. For so long, I had been trying to escape my past, but now I realized that it would always be a part of me. The difference now was that I had people in my life who helped me carry that weight, people who reminded me that I wasn't alone anymore. A few weeks after the trial ended, there was another knock on my door. This time, when I opened it, it was just Mark. "No, Maria." She looked nervous, her hands trembling slightly as she stood there. I didn't know what to say at first. After everything that had happened, I wasn't sure how I felt about her showing up on my doorstep. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, her voice breaking the silence. "I didn't want any of this. I didn't want to take your house. I'm just trying to figure out who I am." I stood there for a moment, unsure of how to respond. Part of me wanted to shut the door and never see her again, but another part of me understood. She had been caught in the middle of our parents' manipulation, just like I had been for years. "I believe you," I finally said, "but this doesn't change what they did." She nodded, her eyes full of regret. "I know, and I'm trying to get away from them, too. I don't want to be like them." It wasn't an apology that fixed everything, but it was a start. Maria wasn't the enemy here. Our parents were. And while I wasn't ready to forgive her completely, I wasn't going to hold on to the anger forever. I had spent too much of my life holding on to things that only weighed me down. As I closed the door behind her, I felt a strange sense of closure. The past wasn't something I could ever erase, but I could choose to move forward. I had my house, my life with Nora, and my friends who had become my family. And for the first time, I felt like I was finally free.